Hello everybody and welcome to the Law of Trusts for the SQE specification. This is going to be an introductory video in which we essentially go through the specification very briefly, outline the scope of this series of videos for the future, and think about some of the citations and further reading for this particular series of lessons. And so fundamentally then, this is going to be representative of an introduction to the subject of trusts for the SQE specification itself. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing. We're going to examine what the SQE specification says. It's very similar to all of the other videos on that particular topic. We'll talk about the sort of broad themes and the broad topics that we will be exploring that the SQE specification specifically cites, and then we will think about some of the very specific information that is required to understand this particular course, which will then of course bring us into looking at the scope of this series of videos. So one thing that we should note that has been noted in all the other introduction videos on this particular topic is the specification. The SQE specification requires a certain standard of knowledge and a certain applicability of that knowledge, if you will. And it says that for all of these different modules that candidates are required to apply relevant core legal principles and rules appropriately and effectively. And then here comes the standard. The standard is at the level of a competent newly qualified solicitor in practice. And then the applicability of that is to realistic client-based and ethical problems and situations. And then in the following areas I'll talk about on the next slide. So this represents a standard which is higher than the standard that had previously been established with the LPC, and it represents what exactly the type of questions you are going to be asked in the first SQE exams, what they're going to look like. They're going to look like questions where we have to apply relevant core legal principles and rules at the level of a newly qualified solicitor in practice to realistic, client-based and ethical problems and situations. Simple as that, really. In terms of the following areas include things relating to the express and implied trust, to the fiduciary relationship, and all those different kinds of things. But more specifically, we have the scope of this series of lessons, which is the more detailed examination of what we are going to be exploring. So fundamentally, what we will be talking about are the following areas of law. We're going to be talking about the creation and the requirement of an express trust. We will, before this, in fact, spend some lessons talking about what the trust even is, talking about the nature of equity, the history of equity, the relationship between law and equity, and how trusts arise out of these basic principles of equity. But then once we've gone through that basic introductory lessons, those introductory lessons, we're going to talk about the creation of the express trust. This requires an examination of the three certainties, the various different formalities that are required for the creation of an express trust, and the nature of constitution of a trust. So there'll be quite a lot of lessons on just this first topic right here, before we then move on to looking at the idea of beneficial entitlement, and then start thinking about the delineation between the two different types of purpose trusts, one which is charitable in nature and one which is non-charitable in nature. There's a distinction between the two. There are very specific rules, as you can probably imagine, on requirements for the charitable trusts and what is allowed essentially for a charitable trust, and then of course the non-charitable purpose trust as well. We will talk about resulting trusts, we will talk about trusts of the family home, we will talk about the liability of strangers to the trust, we will talk about the fiduciary relationship, as well as thinking about the nature of trustees and the liability of trustees in various different circumstances. This is essentially going to be the requirements for your understanding of the SQE specification. Throughout every single video, I will have a slide at the very start of those lessons identifying which part of the SQE specification we're talking about before then going through and looking at the elements themselves. So you can just basically tick off that particular piece of content as and when we go. Now, in terms of citations and sources, there are quite a few sources here that are not SQE specific. So if you're somebody who has time on your hands, I don't know how you do if you're doing the SQE, but if you have time on your hands, then the first 3 citations here, the Graham Virgo textbook, for example, these are all very depth and detailed understandings of equity and trusts. This goes into far more detail than the SQE specification essentially requires of you. So just bear that in mind, that one of the main things about the SQE is that there's not that much reliance on things like case law, only where cases are necessary to be understood. But for the most part, you don't need to understand where certain rules come from, or the facts of certain cases, or the legal rationales of the judges who make those rulings. But you can go into that in more detail if you want to, by looking at those introductory textbooks there. But of course, the last 2 are probably more familiar with to you. The textbook for the SQE, the revision guide for the SQE, very basic stuff. Where there is any additional content, so if I decide to make a video that has a case that you don't necessarily need to have an understanding of for the SQE specification, I'll make it very clear that you don't need to know this, but if you want to know it in more detail, then it will be there for you to have a better understanding of, just because I find that some people feel like they get a better understanding of basic principles if they understand where those principles came from, for example. So just bear that in mind. As for the videos themselves, the first 5 videos, as always, will be freely available to everyone to get an idea of what these lessons are like. The rest will be on the SQE membership level. And for the most part, we will also be going through some practice problem questions as well at the end. But bear in mind that this is a series that is supposed to be focusing on revising the SQE and to sort of brush up your knowledge of the SQE. So just bear that in mind as well. I hope everybody's enjoyed this video, and I will see everybody in the next lesson, where we will start talking about and unpacking some of the basic principles of equity and providing with some basic introductory content before we start diving into the specification itself in more detail.